1 week ago, Kentucky Governor Matt Bevin and legislative leaders announced their plan to save and overhaul Kentucky's embattled pension system. Since then, many questions have arisen from across the state. So Kentucky Living went straight to the governor at the governor's mansion to ask him about his plan and how it will affect you. I'm Joe Arnold here with the Governor Matt Bevin of Kentucky. You know, with Kentucky Living, of course, is the publication for Kentucky's electric cooperatives. The mission of the co-ops is to improve the quality of life for Kentucky, but there's one major issue which has been holding Kentucky back, and the governor has been tackling, and that is the issue of the crushing pension crisis. Governor, thanks for talking to us. We want to hear more about this plan, but I'll tell you from the very outset, you have already succeeded for years, as you know, as a political reporter, and this was one issue that never quite was brought into the light of day. Yeah. You've already succeeded before doing any legislation by making it front and center issue number one.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm grateful for that, but I did from the time that I was running, obviously, for office. I talked about it. It was in my blueprint for a better Kentucky. I've talked about it at each of my State of the Commonwealth addresses. And it is a shame that it has taken this degree of concerted discussion to bring it into the light of day. Part of why we have the worst funded pension system in America is because this has been kicked down the road and kicked down the road for decades, actually, here in Kentucky. And so it's time to fix it. We can't keep kicking this. Everyone has known this isn't a state secret of any sort. People know that the pension's in trouble, and it's time that we actually remedy it. So this time is upon us.
It's a situation, though, it's like the national budget deficit. It's something which is, or the debt, something which is always there. It doesn't ever really seem to affect me as a Kentuckian or as an American, at least as far as I know. It's somewhat nebulous. So before we get to the concerns people have about the solution, let's talk about why it is a big deal. What is it causing? What issues is it causing? How is it, in fact, holding us back?
Well, here's on several fronts. Number one, it affects the credit rating of the state. And we have been continuously downgraded in recent years by S&P and Moody's and Fitch's and others who rate states and companies on their credit rating and their credit worthiness. And we've been downgraded time and time again, in large measure because of our unfunded pension liability. When we are downgraded, we are a bigger credit risk. We're one of the 5 biggest credit risks of any state in America. That means it's harder for us to borrow money to do things that our state might need and want to do. It also makes us less likely for big business to want to come to, because they say, why would I go to a state that might leave me as a corporate entity holding the bag? It's also important to understand that if we have these liabilities, they do by law have to be paid. To pay them comes at the expense of everything else that people care about. So you talk about community living, the things people care about in their communities. You want schools, you want safe living environment, you want law enforcement, and you want roads and bridges to be maintained as we would expect them to be. The cost of doing that comes from the same pool of assets that are required to fund this pension. So if we allow that hole to get so deep that we are ultimately forced by lawsuit to fill it, it will come at the expense of everything else that people want, which is why it has to be addressed before we become in a crisis mode.
Would there be a judge then somewhere who's dictating the budget rather than the governor?
It could well be. I mean, there is a legal obligation to pay things, and yet it's important to understand this. I hear from people who say, well, the state needs to just raise the money. Well, that means raising taxes on everybody. Who wants to have that degree of tax burden put on them? No company, no individual. People can leave. There's no requirement that people stay in the state. It would be so antithetical to the very ways we want to grow our state's economy. So we don't want to jack the taxes up on people. That may ultimately be where some source of money comes from. People say, well, the state should sell excess property. We could sell every state park, every building, every car, every pencil, everything the state owns. It wouldn't meet even 10% of the obligation. It wouldn't meet even a fraction of what we owe. So we've got to come up with the money by coming up with a long-term plan. That's what we've done. We have a 30-year plan. It will take 30 years to fix this problem.
I know that you're focusing on the solution and not the problem, but that said, people will be wondering, who are just starting to pay attention to this issue, how in the world did we get here in the first place? I mean, why is it that if this is an inviolable contract and this is something that everyone knew and people agree to these obligations, why wasn't it fully funded all along?
We had, it's going to be a shocker to some of your viewers here, but sometimes in Frankfurt, wording matters and people are able to put little escape hatches for themselves. And previous legislatures had put in a requirement to fund the base level amounts, but then also to have what was called an actuarially required contribution, an ARC payment. You often hear people talk about that, ARC, actuarially required contribution. Their in-state statute, though, says that that may be contributed. Now, when there's a may, a lot of legislators have chosen it to be may not. And there's nothing that mandated that. There was nothing illegal about that. Legally, they did what was required of them. But the amount to make whole an amount to keep us from getting deeper in a hole, in I think 15 of the last 15 budget cycles, I think it's been funded 12 times. I mean, I've done it each time that I've been, and that's, you know, take me out of the equation, and it essentially hasn't been getting done. So to that end, we've got to stop kicking the can down the road. It was partially a failure to make contributions, but I will say this, and this is important to understand. Even if we had made every ARC payment that was required, every one of them, we would still have a hole that's 84% the size of the hole we're in now. That would have only taken care of 16% of this unfunded liability. The rest of it came from using bogus assumption numbers. Our actuaries, frankly, failed us. And the people that were on our boards who had oversight and fiduciary responsibility failed us. They did not take into consideration reality. We assumed rates of return in the market that we knew we weren't going to get. So we kept saying, well, we'll make it up by returns in the market. We didn't get those. We said we'll make it up by increased payroll and people paying in, even though we knew for the last 10 years we've been cutting payroll and the amount of people in state government have been going down under the last several administrations. So we've been using bogus numbers, and the reason we did is that if we assume inputs from those places, that means we don't have to put money in. We in Frankfurt. And the we precluded me being here, but those that preceded me said that if we don't have to put money in, we can spend that money on other things. And unfortunately, this is how this problem was created. It was created over decades. It's happened under the watch of several of the last governors and administrations. And unfortunately, I'm now having to clean it up, and that's what we're going to do.
Obviously, the other areas you're talking about, though, is that the areas where that money was being spent included on education and roads and buildings and infrastructure. The problem is that it was not funny money, but the money didn't actually exist. In other words, it should have been obligated elsewhere.
Correct. You look at our road plans. I mean, there's 3-4 times as many things in a road plan as there is money to pay for it. It is funny money. We're spending money that doesn't exist. But additionally, too, I would challenge people, look at us educationally. 60% of our kids can't read at grade level. I mean, this is a problem. And you look in some of our school systems, it's worse numbers even than that. So clearly, we have upside potential on a lot of fronts. And so if, in fact, we've been using the money for all these other things, why are our bridges in such a state of disrepair? Why are our roads increasingly in states of disrepair? Why is our educational system struggling relative to other states, as indeed it is? The reason being is we've not been good stewards of the taxpayers' money. And we have an obligation. I, as governor, my administration, and the people that are sent here in the House and the Senate have a responsibility to be better stewards of the taxpayers' money.
I promise I'll get to your solutions, but the one last follow-up on that, and you might recall my old political reporting days, I always think I try to channel what people are asking. And I'm always wondering about, I think they're asking sometimes, well, why don't we do what the private sector did, as far as pensions are concerned? And there's a lot of companies that were able to reconfigure those things, but we're different as a U.S. state rather than as a private corporation and the kind of flexibility they can have?
Yes and no. I mean, what they've done in the private sector is they've gone to defined contribution plans. I would ask any of your listeners out there, anybody they know who does not work for the state government, are they in a defined benefit plan? Chances are they're not. They might be, but probably not. Almost everyone's gone. Interestingly, all the newspapers who hate everything that this administration has done, hate the fact that we're trying to find a solution to this, and are largely poo-pooing the efforts we're making. Every one of those reporters doesn't have a DB plan. Their papers of necessity moved to defined contribution plans years ago. They didn't quit their jobs. They didn't leave. They've managed to attract new people to work there. It's a lot of scare tactics about what will happen if you go to a defined contribution plan. But we've had to do that in other instances to maintain the financial viability. I would say this, if this was a private pension plan and not a public pension plan, The federal government, by IRS statute, by law, would have shut them down years ago.
That was my point. In
Yeah.
other words, there are airlines or other,
Yeah.
I mean, all kind of corporations over the years that, however you want to put it, over-promised or over-obligated, but that's where the Pension Guarantee Corporation
Yes.
comes in, but we're not in that situation. We have to
Correct.
take care of this on our own.
The PBGC, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, is a quasi-government entity that comes in and seizes private pension plans, shuts them down, and pays out anybody who's in the plan 15 cents on the dollar. They do that when a plan gets to 60% funding or less. Every plan in Kentucky would have been seized by now. We are in horrific shape. But there is no equivalent for the public pension system. In America, it's not just Kentucky. We have the worst funded of all the states. But if you look at all the states combined, and you look at all the county and local public plans combined, and you look at the federal plans combined, and you put them all together, this is about a $4 to $5 trillion problem in America. And so we are at the front edge of trying to come up with a solution. And I believe that what we've put forward, while it will take 30 years, it will get us out the other end of the tunnel. And it will become a model for other states to follow because they really don't have an alternative.
You've already mentioned the moving from overall a defined benefit to a defined contribution, and the governor, as well as legislative leaders last week, announcing that keeping the promise plan. You are certainly aware of the concerns because people say, well, you're not keeping this promise, you're not keeping that promise, but overall, you believe that you're keeping the basic promises that
Sure.
were part of that inviolable contract in the first place.
Here's the irony. For all those who don't like this plan, they have no solution of their own. Their solution is to keep your head in the sand and pretend there's not a problem. But that guarantees you that the people who are retired now, their checks will stop coming in some of our plans in the next 3 to 5 years. In the KERS non-hazardous plan, there's about 9 to 16% funding, depending on what numbers you use. It is ridiculously underfunded. It's a checking account at this point, and it's bleeding out. So those who hate the plan have no alternative. They have no solution. They have no ideas. They just don't like this idea. They want to pretend that everything is rosy and well. It's like the emperor's new clothes. But the emperor is naked, and people need to start to realize financially we are in dire straits. But what's interesting as well is that not only do they have no solution, but the things that they say are not the promise are things that were never the promise. We've been giving people things and doing things that were never allowed. For example, these high 3 and high 5s, some of those are statutorily required. But people that were on a high 3, meaning they could earn whatever they earned, but then they got to get paid paid benefits in retirement for the rest of their lives based on the highest 3 years worth of attainment. And yet we've allowed even that to be played with. So for example, there are people retiring with a high 25 months. You take your high 2 years plus the last month, so people didn't even have to take their high 3 years. And the world I come from, 3 years has 36 months in it. In Frankfurt, 3 years has 25 months in it. And guess what? The previous administration, as a way to play games and pretend they were balancing the budget, stopped paying people twice in June so that they only paid half the payroll in the month of June. And that allowed them to pretend that they were spending less money because the fiscal year ends June 30th. Well, guess what? You have to pay people the amount you owe them, so what did they do? They paid them 3 times in July. They just kicked the can into the next year, and they've been doing this every single year. Well, guess what the most popular retirement date in Kentucky is? It happens to be August 1st. Why is that? Because people take their last month, which is July, in which they get 3 paychecks, they multiply it times 12 because you're allowed to do that. I would defy anybody to find where in the promise that was. These are the kind of games that have been getting played. We're no longer going to allow certain games to be played. The promises we're keeping are the promises that were actually made. We're allowing people to earn a defined benefit for life if they work 27 years. Every bit of that is staying in place.
For now.
For now, exactly. And for new employees, their defined contribution. For people who are in KERS non-hazardous, they're going into this defined contribution plan if they're 5 years or less, for Tier 3. But for the vast majority of people that are in the existing DB plan, they are allowed to continue forward. For new people, of course it has to change. It goes back to what we said. Structurally, if we don't change it for new people coming in, then we are guaranteeing those retired and those working now will also not get the promise that was made to them.
Obviously, it's less than what people may have been expecting according to the way things have been up until this point. But is shared sacrifice, is that a good way to put this? Because we're asking then those people to look at their situation differently, the state to look at things differently, sure. School districts and other districts to look at things differently. Is this, how would you describe that? I
mean, I think that's a fair way to look at it, but truth be told, we're really not making changes for people. There's very little sacrifice for those in the system. And for those not yet in the system, they shouldn't have an assumption of what's going to be available for them. I love it when I see these comments from people, well, my son or daughter will never work for this. Well, good. They shouldn't then. If they can go get a better job doing something else, let them. That's okay. But for many people, it will be attractive. We will have a defined contribution plan, a 401k, with a much more generous match than exists in most private sector plans. I can tell you that, having been in this business. It is a very good plan. As far as shared sacrifice, there's very, very little sacrifice being asked of people. We've asked some groups to simply say, okay, we're not going to take cost of living adjustments for 5 years. Well, the inflation's been pretty static and non-existent. And so, yeah, I mean, to the degree that everybody's expected to give a little something, sure. But my goodness, this is a big problem for the entire state. And for any one group or any one interest organization to think that they should be untouched and everyone else should pay the sacrifice, I think is inappropriate.
What about local taxing districts, like a school district, and what should they expect as a result of your plan?
Well, it's interesting. If we, based on assumptions that are now required by law, if they were applied next year, if you look at CERS, some of these counties and some of these school districts, their cost for non-hazardous plans, their cost above and beyond what they're already paying would go up on average over 50%. For the hazard duty folks, it would go up over 60%. So everything they're paying right now, which they're straining under to try to meet the obligation for people that are retired and not even working in their districts anymore, they would see those numbers go up 50 to 60% each. They can't afford it. They don't have the money. So in our plan, we recognize that. And we say we allow a 4-year period to start to feather in that cost. The first year, no change at all. In fiscal year 2019, no change. You will pay just what you paid in the previous year. But then the next year, you'll pay 1/3 of the difference. Then the next year, 2/3. And by year 4, you're paying the full amount. So this is really a 30 years plus 3 years to feather this in. 30 years plus 4, counting the grace period we give people. This is all taking into consideration the fact that the obligation has to be paid, but we also want to be cognizant of the fact that these communities and these districts, they don't have the money. But they're going to have to figure out where they're going to come up with it over the next 4 years, because it does have to be paid.
Well, just as people who are facing retirement or looking at their careers have to look at hard numbers.
Exactly.
We all have to do the same thing, and when the variables change, right?
And I'll tell you, there's an increasing outrage on the part of the 90-something% of people for whom they don't get any of this. They pay all of it, but they get none of it. And they see their neighbors who seem to have something that they don't have, and they're being required to pay for it. We don't want to get to the point where you have literal animosity to the degree that's starting to percolate now. If we don't fix this problem over the next 30 years, you're going to hit the wall, and you will have people truly, there will be a level of upset, the likes of which would make all that exists pale by comparison.
I'll have to ask you then politically, because there is a danger there. A danger for you, a danger for your party, a danger for legislators who are stepping up with you to say, we want to do this. There's a reason, as you suggested when we first started out, why this hasn't been tackled before.
Sure, because it's hard. This is where the adults need to step up. And adults and those that are out there, if you go to work every day and you work and you pay your taxes and you're raising your children to be responsible, contributing members of society, at a certain point you're outraged and offended at the idea that everyone expects to use your money to fix all their problems. And you ought to be outraged. The truth be told, we have an obligation, we have a responsibility, and we're going to meet that responsibility. But if anyone comes to this town and thinks that they don't have to make hard decisions, they shouldn't be coming to this town. This is exactly why we get sent here. We get sent here to do the will of the people, to make hard decisions. It's why I ran. I didn't aspire to this. I didn't groom myself to this. I didn't study political science. This is the first political job I've ever had. I'm a taxpayer and I'm an employer. I'm a person who has tried to make his way against tremendous headwinds coming from government and a cost of other people mismanaging monies that I sent in and others sent in. And it became frustrating, and this is part of why I ran. This is the time for the adults to step up. And frankly, I'm not worried about what this means politically. I think there's a lot of people out there, including a lot of your viewers and listeners, who are hungry for adults to step up and start dealing with reality, because everybody knows it needs to happen. So I think we're going to be rewarded. I got elected winning 106 out of 120 counties by telling people I was going to do these things. And then the next year, we went from, when I was elected, we had 46 seats out of 100. We now have 64 in the House. The Democrats had controlled the House for 96 straight years. It wasn't a Democrat or Republican thing. It was a who's going to step up and do the hard things kind of thing. And when other people ran saying they're going to support me doing hard things that are politically unpopular, they got elected in overwhelming numbers. So we have all the votes necessary to do it. And I predict, as surely as we're talking, we do this and the other things that we were sent here to do, there's going to be 70 members of the Republican Party after 2018. I'd lay good odds on it. I really would.
We'll talk to you again next year, but hopefully before then. Process-wise, when do we expect the session to actually be called?
Soon, very soon. I mean, part of it is I really want to make sure people have in their hands the actual details they need, the legislators in particular, the people that are voting on it. All of the details we released last week in our press conference. And all of the subsequent details we released not only to the media, but then we gave them complete access to our budget director to go through it for a couple of hours. Any questions they have. None of that is changing in the document that's going to come out. The detail that's going to come out is a lot of it's like the baguettes in the Old Testament. It's just that it's all in there, it's all important, it's all connected, but most people don't bother to read through all that. But some people need to, including the people that are voting on it. It's what ties one statute to another and makes sure that this thing is actually tenable. But the operative parts, how each respective plan is going to be affected, it's already out there. As soon as all the details are in the hands of every legislature and they can read it, we'll call this session, we'll pass it, and we'll move on to the next challenge.
And of course, January is the regular General Assembly, and then you expect to call another session after that for tax reform?
Possibly. We'll see. If we can't get tax reform done as part of this budget session, and we may or may not be able to, it may or may not make sense, then yes, I would do another special session to address that. Because we've got to update and modernize our tax code. We just do. It's very antiquated. It's counterproductive. We exempt more monies than we take in. Everybody knows that as well. That's something else we've kicked down the road for a long time. We have a stack, I kid you not, Joe, a stack, it's about this tall, of blue ribbon panels in 5-year studies and plans that have been put together on tax reform over the last 30 years. It's literally this tall. And we have gone through the process of going back through every single one of them. Not one of them was ever really acted on. Everybody studies it and nobody does anything. I'm not doing another study on it. I'm going to act. And we're going to take all the information that we already know to exist, and we're going to look at the common themes that have been for 30 years suggested by people that we need to do X. We're going to start to do X, Y and Z and A and B and C, and whatever we need to do, and we're going to make Kentucky more competitive. I wasn't elected to have a cush ride. I'm like I told somebody earlier, I'm at the parade too, but I'm the guy with the shovel behind the elephant. Where everyone's enjoying the show, my job and that of our current legislature is to clean up the mess for those that have preceded us. We're going to clean it up and we're going to make Kentucky shine.
One little pushback, and that is that you mentioned does all those stacks of reports or commission and guidelines. Frankly, you had a commission come in on the pension system, and they recommended things that were even more aggressive than what you're putting forward.
But this wasn't very different. I did not ask for a blue ribbon panel. I did not convene people to give suggestions. That was an audit of our existing plans. That was literally something that has never been done. You go back and you read my blueprint for a better Kentucky. I said I was going to audit every plan. In that first budget, the legislature designated money to audit every single plan. You can't begin to address a problem if you don't even know what the problem is. We didn't even know how badly underfunded or how poorly the assumptions or what had contributed to our underfunded status was until we did this audit. This outside group did this audit, and in the course of it came up with suggestions for how we could offset that getting worse. And indeed, we did choose to disregard some of those things, others of which were very much germane to the process itself. We also met with every single group you could think of. You could not name an acronym that represents retired workers in this state that we did not meet with personally on multiple occasions, myself included. So people have been heard for months. This idea that suddenly now we have to talk about it, nonsense. We've been talking about it for months. We've been discussing it, frankly, behind closed doors for years. People have known about it, but very publicly in recent months. and we're about to put this to bed.
Nearly 2 years ago, Governor Matt Bevin was elected governor of Kentucky. At that time, actually, the first interview you gave after your election was to me, and I appreciate you giving us this opportunity to get a look behind the scenes of the pension system, and please keep us posted.
You're very welcome. And stay tuned. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done, but we intend to do it. We're here, we're serious, we have our foot on the gas, and we're going to make Kentucky all that Kentucky has the potential to be.
Thank you.
Thank you.